ever been so tired and so exhausted and so frustrated with those around you that you just want to get away? Probably. So that's how Jesus was feeling, and that's how the disciples were. This comes after Jesus had found out about the death of John the Baptist, and he tried to get away, but instead the crowds came round and followed him everywhere, and he fed the 5,000. And then we get to this point. He has had enough. He tried to get away and it didn't work, so he's had enough. And the disciples have had enough too. You know, in the feeding of the 5,000, they tell Jesus, just send them away. They can find their own food. I don't care anymore. I've had enough. So Jesus says, okay, disciples, you've had enough. You can go. Get in the boat and go where we're going next. And he dismissed the crowd. And then he went up the mountainside to pray. He went by himself. He took the time to have that time to reflect, to contemplate, to pray. He fed himself the space he needed. It's very easy when we're at that point of complete exhaustion to just say, oh, just leave. Just go, just leave, and you go into your own little space, and then you sit and wallow. That is not what Jesus did. But he did have to have his time completely by himself. And he also knew that the disciples needed a bit of time out themselves. So they got all night in the boat by themselves. And when we come to the disciples, so they've had enough. They've been sent away by Jesus. They're probably not too impressed about that, because probably what they wanted was some quiet time with Jesus, who was telling them everything and guiding them. And they felt nice and safe. And then they go in this boat, and the wind's against them. And I learnt to sail as a teenager. And on more than one occasion, my sister agreed to get in a boat with me, and my father would say to me, it's fine, SJ, go out and turn around, and then Caroline will bring the boat back. Of course, we always got out, and then we're coming back against the wind, and she wants nothing to do with it. Because it's really hard work. And on one of those occasions, she ended up in a cold lake in Scotland, and I had to go fish her out. It's not pleasant to sail in a wind that is up against you. It doesn't matter how big the boat. If you are against the wind and you are trying to sail or row, it is really hard. Andrew might tell you the story about me attempting to paddleboard in the Caribbean. First trip out, absolutely fine. I was doing really well. I've got really good balance. So I can paddleboard standing up without any trouble. Second time out, I just could not get back. No matter how hard I tried, I was going in the opposite direction to where I was, because the waves, the tide was all against me, and I just was not strong enough to paddle against it. And that's how the disciples were feeling. They couldn't make headway. All of them were working together on the oars, and they just could not make headway. Sea of Galilee is a pretty big lake. But it's not that big that it would take them all night if the wind wasn't against them. It was extremely hot. They are exhausted. They are scared, probably. They're a bit tired. They're doubting what's going on. And then they see the impossible. And it is easier for them to believe that they are seeing a ghost than it is for them to believe they're seeing a miracle. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not very good at believing in ghosts. So I certainly don't think that the first thing I would assume when I saw some weird thing on the water was that it was a ghost. I'm not sure I would think it was Jesus either. But they really believed this must be a ghost. And they were terrified, because clearly a ghost cannot be a good thing at this point. And I kind of get that. If you've been working really hard, you're tired to exhaustion, you start seeing things, or at least you think you're seeing things, were scared. But they hadn't understood what was really going on when Jesus fed the 5,000. They were used to Jesus healing the sick. But then there were a number of religious people around the time who healed the sick. You know, we have religious people around that heal the sick. I'm sure that there were many of them. And lots of people wanted that healing, and they all believed that Jesus could heal the sick. But they didn't really understand that when 5 loaves and 2 fishes fed 5,000 men, a unnumbered number of women and children, and still had some left over, that was something different. That's not something anyone else had done before, and I certainly don't hear many stories of that happening now. They hadn't understood it because their minds were set on the fact that they were believing in God. They were following this rabbi, this teacher who had this gift of healing and who said amazing things and preached sermons that everyone wanted to hear. But they were just following an amazing preacher. And then they understood that Jesus could walk on water. And again, I don't know anyone else that can do that. Even on my paddleboard I struggled. And there's this great big floating thing underneath my feet. And suddenly the water's calm. They're calm because at that point, those disciples needed to rest. No matter how hard our lives get, no matter how tough things are, we always need a time to rest. Jesus took his time up on the mountain. He went up there and he rested. They needed to rest. So Jesus calms the waters and they get to shore. And before long, the crowds descend again and it becomes crazy and hectic and they don't know what to do with themselves. They needed that time of calm before they could do their work again. But they also needed the time of trouble against the waves and the wind and everything else in order to understand what it was they were seeing in Jesus. I don't know about you, but I know an awful lot of people who suddenly decide they believe in God when life gets tough. When life is easy, and unless they have been brought up and retained that belief in God and that faith, it's only when things get tough that they suddenly ask God to fix it. We're human beings. We want someone, we have suddenly developed this belief that there is some greater power that will fix it. Some of us are lucky enough to believe that when the going is good. But there are a lot of people, and I'm sure that you've all met them, who are sitting in hospital rooms and going, God, if you fix this, I'll do anything. And when that happens, and when they have that personal understanding, then their lives are changed. Andrew made the theme of today about faith. But I came to read this and I came to understand that you need a bit of everything to have faith. These disciples, they were in no doubt before this incident that they had a faith in God and a faith that Jesus would lead them through what they were going through, that Jesus was the man to follow. But they didn't understand until they really needed rescuing and they really needed help, and Jesus appears walking across the lake and calming it, that Jesus could work miracles. I don't know what they thought about the sick people that suddenly could start to walk, the blind that could see, all of those things where, just touching the hem of his cloak was enough to heal. But they clearly did not believe. And the reason we know that is that not only did Mark write about this, but Matthew thought it was important enough to put the same thing in his gospel. We know that this was important. That this story, that this telling of this story in this way, that the disciples were on their own, they were isolated, they were feeling a bit lost. And Jesus went from his place of quiet and calm, where he was clearly quite happy, and went out onto the lake to help them. So what does this mean for us? Well, it's not just about people in hospitals asking for God to rescue them, or about me dropping my sister in a lake while sailing. It's really about us understanding that the times ahead, that the times as a church, the times between when we are working for God will not be easy. That we will work all day, we will be exhausted, and still we will have to do more. But God will come and give us rest. Enough rest for us to then work all day again. Sometimes that scares the heck out of me. But I know that that time of rest will be there. There are times, and there have been times, when I have been absolutely exhausted. Where I have had enough of people. Where I have had enough of people wanting something from me. When I have had enough of doing what it is that I'm being asked to do. And somehow the following morning I get up and do it all again. And if you saw me going to bed at night, you would not believe that the morning would happen. But it always does. And it's not just because I go to sleep and 8 hours later I feel much better. It is also about taking time out for myself. At this point in the gospel, we hear lots about Jesus helping the physical ailments of the people around him, of him preaching to them. But the concerns of the people were about the physical. You know, they carried the sick on mats. They begged to just touch to be healed. They were so worried about their physical environment, their physical health. They completely ignored the spiritual and the soul. And Jesus put that first. That's why he took the time to pray. That's why we have to take the time to pray, because no matter how busy we are, if we are just full of busyness all the time, then we don't get a chance to recover, to rest, to be strong, to go on. And it doesn't matter to God whether your rest time is enforced by falling asleep, by medical intervention, because, you know, sometimes we just need that. Or because God kicks you on the backside and breaks something of you so that you have to sit on your backside and let yourself recover, because that's happened to me too. You can get so busy that if you forget to pay attention, God will find a way to make you rest if you don't do it for yourself. And part of being whole and following Jesus and following the examples put out in the Bible is listening to this request, listening to what is being told to us, listening to that need. If Jesus needed to go onto a mountain and pray, then why do we think we don't need to? But I know many of us, and me included, who completely forget that part of the process. Jesus needed time out. We're no better at being humans. We're certainly no better at being spiritual. We need to follow that example. We can hopefully avoid the all night in a boat with the wind against us trick in order to get to that point. But we do need to take that time, because otherwise Jesus will put us in a boat all night without the wind against us. To make us take the time. To remember why we're here. To remember that we are not invincible. That we can only do God's work if we take the time.